Since the end of the 1870s, Archangel Michael has been on his mission to bring us a new revelation. Before Michael, Archangel Gabriel brought something upon humanity that allowed us to obtain from our outer senses knowledge of the material world. But Michael now brings us something from the spiritual world. And in fact, Archangel Michael is the representative of Christ. So he actually brings the Christ impulse. And this is a unique moment in history that has never happened before, because this Christ impulse is connected to what is actually the second crucifixion of Christ on the etheric plane. And this second crucifixion is something that we must come closer to understanding, because this crucifixion of Christ in the physical signified his merging with the aura of the earth. So he's been living in the spiritual sphere of the earth, right? But since the dawning of materialism from the 1500s up until the 1900s, the souls that have been passing through the gates of death have been carrying conceptions that have been devoid of spirituality and into that spiritual sphere where Christ was. And by doing so, they've been bringing what we can categorize as darkness to that sphere, which Christ had to take into himself. And so the Christ being has literally been suffocated out of that spiritual sphere. And because of this lack of spiritual comprehension, he'll have to reveal himself in the physical sphere. That means that more and more human souls will be able to find this once hidden Christ consciousness on the physical plane as a direct personal experience. And he comes through Michael. But unlike other archangels, Michael is silent, and he's the true spirit of freedom because he doesn't guide by force. No, he'll merely give subtle indications because it's we who must go out to meet him out of our own will and our own volition, which is done through our ego because that's our epoch's mission, to go from individualism back into having a spiritual soul. So we'll go over the Christ impulse, what it means, why we need it, how Archangel Michael brings this revelation of Christ, and how we can connect with it in our lifetime. To begin to understand the Christ impulse, we have to go into what the being of Christ did. Yes, he was crucified and resurrected on the material plane, but what was the significance of this? Christ actually accomplished something that no other being had ever done. Humans, because we've incarnated on the material plane, we have a physical body and we experience death, right? But spiritual beings, such as angels and archangels, don't experience death. See, there is no death in the spiritual world, only transformation of consciousness. And among all the spiritual beings, none has ever even died, except for Christ. Through his own will, from being a cosmic power, in a sphere where there is no death, he became an earthly power and went through a physical death to merge himself with the aura of the earth. But that's not all. Because he merged with the aura of the earth, he's been dwelling in this, let's call it the spiritual sphere of earth. And he's taken his residence here because of what he foresaw happening in this spiritual sphere. This spiritual sphere is not separate from our physical sphere. They both interpenetrate each other. But what he foresaw is that this spiritual sphere would be infected with a certain darkness. And that's because since the 1400s, because more and more humans entered this spiritual sphere through the portals of death, and they brought with them their earthly, materialistic ideas that were devoid of spirituality, it had a certain effect there, right? It's caused a black sphere of materialism, which would have diverted the natural evolution of Earth. But Christ was now able to take this into himself from the spiritual sphere. But this was no small task. By taking in this darkness, Christ has been essentially suffocated out of this spiritual sphere. And by doing this, he's died again. He's been crucified again, now spiritually. And this is monumental because, as I mentioned, spiritual beings don't experience death, but Christ did. And because he did, he'll be resurrected again on the physical plane now in the form of an archangel. And that archangel is Michael. So from the 20th century on, which is now, the resurrection of Christ consciousness will be felt in the physical sphere of Earth, and it'll be felt by humans as a direct personal experience. People will be able to come directly to Christ now through their own will, through their own individuality. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew people didn't receive their revelations through a consciousness like the one we have now today, but through a hazy kind of clairvoyance similar to our dreams today. And in fact, many stories of the ancient revelations were through dreams, right? Or visions. So they had these revelations when they raised themselves up to their God, Yahweh, through a different state of consciousness, though, that we now possess. But they felt that who they spoke to was not Yahweh directly. They spoke to a messenger of Yahweh, and this messenger was also the Archangel Michael. And because the Hebrew people received their revelations in this hazy, dreamlike state, Yahweh was known as the ruler of the night, and Michael was the servant of the ruler, Yahweh. However, the esoteric circles all understood this, that the divine knowledge would have to come out of the nighttime situation into the daytime, into waking consciousness. And that's what all the sun worship was about. They were preparing for this transition into the daytime revelation. And this daytime revelation is the Christ impulse, brought through again by Archangel Michael. While Michael once brought the ancient Hebrews their revelations by night, it will be Michael again. But now Michael has been transformed from the servant of Yahweh to the servant of Christ. This daytime revelation is also intimately tied to our evolution on Earth. See, we've evolved out of using the intellectual soul, which involved the mastery of materialism and the intellect. We developed the intellect through the senses, right? Our physical senses. And most recently, we developed our consciousness soul, which was our ego. So we have individuality now, but we have to bridge the gap now between the consciousness, individuality, and the spiritual soul. And we have to do that through our ego, which means we have to do it out of freedom, out of our own free will. You see, the deterioration of the earth with global warming and pollution of our oceans, the physical earth is in a state of decline. And only by evolving to this next stage of humanity, the spiritual soul, will we be able to save the earth. Because we are the earth. Like cells in a body, we make up the earth and the earth's health. It's like we become cells who have individualized, and now we think we can do whatever we want, right? And in a way, that's true. We have our freedom of will, but it's killing our earth. The real mission of our times is, by this freedom of will, though, are we going to choose evolution or devolution? However, we can only start to save the earth when we really start to understand nature in its totality. And by coming back to spirit and bringing a spiritual understanding into our natural sciences, that's the only way I see us getting past this inevitable decline of Earth. Because indeed, behind every physical phenomena is actually a spiritual impetus. But our current science doesn't admit that, because they can't find the physical proof through our senses, which is what we use to develop our modern science. From about like the 1500s to the 1900s, we had the development of the intellect, of our power of thinking logically and intellectually about things. And with this, we saw the explosion of materialism, which was necessary for that logical, sense-driven development. But this was actually brought through by a different archangel. See, here we had the guidance of Archangel Gabriel, which is why Archangel Gabriel was depicted as holding the white lotus, which is a sign of good news. And he was the bringer of good news to come, which was the incarnation of Christ into Jesus of Nazareth. So we had Michael, who brought the ancient Hebrews their night revelation through hazy consciousness. Then it was Gabriel who guided the Greeks and Romans through the development of their intellect, which spawned the explosion of materialism. And now it's Michael again who brings us back to spirit. But this time, Michael has also transformed. He's gone through his own spiritual evolution from being a nighttime spirit to being a daytime spirit. And so, we must look towards Michael for this new light, because it is in fact the spiritual light that we need, which will lift us out of our descent into materialism, back up into spirit. But now there's a fundamental difference. Michael won't bring us the revelation in dreams unconsciously. We'll have to meet him halfway in the daytime through our own will. We'll have to transform our thinking through the consciousness of our I or ego. See, Christ was crucified on his own cross, right? He rose from the dead. He overcame physical death on the material plane through transcending his ego, because he did it not for himself, which would be an egoic act, but he did it for all of humanity. And he did this through the Holy Spirit. Now, this is deeply symbolic because he showed us what our task would be, how we must carry our own cross, which is this: the belief that our existence is merely limited to the material plane. By transcending our materialistic ideas and our attachment to the ego, we come back to the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. And by doing this, we breathe life and light back into the spiritual sphere of our earth, which has been drowned in darkness through the souls that have been adding to that sphere these ideas that have been devoid of spirit. By permeating our thoughts once more with spiritual ideas, we actually breathe life back into the sphere. So don't believe that your thoughts are insignificant. There's a real effect that your thoughts have on the spiritual realm. But thoughts by themselves without our total being aren't going to cut it. We have to start with our thoughts, but it doesn't end there. We have to start with our thoughts, right? Which are tied to our intellect and our physical brains. Then these have to be transformed into what Rudolf Steiner called imagination. Imagination is thought that is no longer bound to the physical brain. So what is this? Let me give an example. We know from spiritual science that the earth evolves, right? Through 7 incarnations, phases, if you will. The first one is Saturn, where the earth was nothing but warmth. You couldn't even stand on that first atmosphere because the ground didn't exist. It was just warmth. But out of this warmth were created warmth bodies, not physical bodies, just conglomerations of warmth. And this eventually became, through many, many thousands of years, became these eggs that were the first physical forms in all of Earth. So now speed that up many more thousands of years, and we have Earth going through a cosmic sleep, or pralaya, and being reborn again. This next phase, Earth goes through its sun phase. Through this sun phase, we have the beginnings of a gaseous form. And so on and so forth. The Earth has been going through all these stages, each time gaining something new. Now in our phase, we've gained matter. So we're living on the material plane. Now, this conception of Earth evolution is an imagination, because this type of idea is not tied to the physical sense-bound brain. This idea is drawn from the spiritual world. So the idea is to transform regular thoughts into these imaginations. And these imaginations, when meditated on correctly, should work on us into a real living experience. Not merely words, but real images that we live through in our souls. Another image we can use is the one of Archangel Michael fighting the dragon. In past times, the dragon meant something different, but now in our times, the dragon represents materialism and all the ideas that went into developing the science that we have today. And this dragon will reach its full potential and will have to be overcome by Michael if these thoughts of materialism continue to dominate our thinking. If we're unable to let spiritual life flow into our sense-bound life, then the fight between Michael and the dragon will be renewed in our times. And in fact, this has already been happening. And for us to take up this fight, to serve on the side of Michael, means to start perceiving the spiritual behind every physical phenomena. And until we do, this thought of Michael fighting the dragon is just an idea. But when we can take this fight up into our own souls, then we embody the idea and it becomes a reality, to what Rudolf Steiner termed an imagination. And it's the same thing with thoughts about the spiritual realm, about Archangel Michael, about the Christ impulse. We actually have to come to feel the experience in our whole being. So through an inner process, we change or transmute an abstract idea into a concrete imaginative experience. This moves the thought that is just floating in our heads to a force that's felt through the soul. This is the very essence, the secret of modern initiation, to get beyond the words to a living experience of the spiritual. Rudolf Steiner. And with that, I'm going to close off on this one. Everybody, thanks for watching, and until next time.